Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of the Empowered Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Manos. Today's guest is Rob Mauceri. Rob, if you wouldn't mind doing a quick intro, can you tell us about your athletic background and your current role?
Yeah, for sure, man. So in terms of like athletic background, kind of a weird, varied one, honestly. My brother and I started in gymnastics and took that, reasonably far. He was elite level. I was around class 2 or 3 back in the day with the class system. So a pretty high level gymnast. After that, found skateboarding and, took that up all the way to being a sponsored skateboarder. Along the way, dabbled in a few other random things, competed in powerlifting at a decent level, and competed in Muay Thai kickboxing as well, just kind of on the side when I was in shape. So, really kind of a weird mix of athletics. And then in terms of coaching and work, currently helping to manage 3 gyms around the DMV, like the DC and Virginia area. So we have 2 in DC, 1 in Tysons, and I run the education for that company, Thesis Personal Training. So currently in charge of about a team of 36 or 37 trainers at this point. So just educating them. And then I myself do in-person coaching and online with currently about 25 in-person clients and about 60-ish remote at the moment. So pretty busy.
Yeah, sounds very busy across all those roles. Do you have a preference between the roles, or do you just find that it's nice to kind of balance it out? Like sometimes you like the variety?
Yeah, I do like the variety. I do love having a lot of in-person contact. Like a lot of people, I think, these days are trying to do only the online route. And I've always done a lot of in-person work. And, I tend to have fun talking to people and having a good time with that. So I don't ever want to cut that out completely. And even now I do, probably 45 sessions a week, 50 sessions a week.
Nice.
I'm in the busier season. So I like to keep that a big part of the work.
You obviously have a large client base amongst your online and in-person clients. I imagine it's a very diverse base. It's not just all one sport or one type of like endeavor, or, some people say they're just fat loss. Some people, and I've seen some people say they're like the glute specialist. They just work with pretty ladies on getting bigger glutes and all sorts of stuff like that. But you work with anybody and everybody, right?
Yeah. I never wanted to specialize in like any one thing. Initially, like when I first started out, coaching years and years ago now was a side gig, and I was doing primarily powerlifters, and then moved on to, Gen Pop clients and more the kind of fat loss and general health focused clients. And then over the years picked up more and more athletes. And these days, I think on the roster currently I have pros in 11 or 12 different sports, and then tons of amateur athletes, tons of just, Gen Pop clients and that as well. So it definitely keeps it, to me, a lot more interesting than like, saying, oh yeah, like you said, the glute specialist or whatever it is. I like the variety and the challenge of thinking of different programs and, coming up with solutions for all these, different problems people have.
So what I find interesting is that both from a career perspective and then also your own athletic endeavors, you're very much a generalist, but it doesn't mean generalists can't achieve high levels in all these different things. In fact, sometimes being really good at one thing can lend itself to being good at another thing that you may not originally think are related. So as far as my background when it comes to my business, my dream originally, I was a college soccer player, I don't know if you know who Paul Favorites is, PJF Performance.
Yeah.
But I wanted to be the soccer version of that. I was like, all right, I'll be the skills guy and the performance guy, but I'm going to be super niche. And I thought that's the best business model. But I was like, well, I'm not going to start with the pro soccer player. So I got to work with like, I don't know, youth athletes, and then they can only train before or after school. So during the daytime, I thought I'd get a couple Gen Pop clients. And then that's how my business kind of organically grew, was a lot of Gen Pop and a little bit of athletes, maybe like a 80-20, 90-10 split sometimes. And I thought like, oh, this is just like the secondary thing, not the main thing. And then I realized that like there's actually a lot to enjoy about training Gen Pop and working with people of different levels of fitness, different goals, different ability levels, but then also like just to give somebody a superpower back in life was such a rewarding ththing. Someone who's like, I can't touch my toes, or I can't get off the ground, or I haven't jumped in 10 years or something. Just any of those things felt just as rewarding to me as like if someone said they scored a game-winning goal for a big tournament. Having said that, it is nice to have the variety. I've started working with athletes of different sports, some combat sports, some different field sports, and then of course still working with Gen Pop, and I find that to be interesting. One of the things I was going to ask you is, working with so many people, there must be some things that you find to be universal, but then of course you can't write one program for everybody. So what do you think is universal amongst your clients? And then what are the main things that you try to make different for them?
Yeah. I mean, I think from like, with everyone I train, I've never had a client that doesn't want to at least put on a little bit of muscle, usually look a little bit better, things like that. If you're thinking of, training principles for that, everybody's going to train hard. Everybody's going to train reasonably close, ish to failure a lot of the time. You're going to use a lot of the same exercises because I mean, while there's no must do exercises or anything like that, certainly there's a few, very basic exercises that are going to work really well for most people, for most muscle groups. And, a lot of them like basic presses, pulls, some kind of squat pattern, a hinge, leg curls, things like that.
Mhm.
They wind up looking, just incredibly similar person to person. The programs don't tend to be all that different, whether it's a Gen Pop client or an athlete. It's just, depending on the sport they're in, I'll
Mhm.
taper the focus just a little bit, based on the demands of the sport. But, honestly, it's really not all that much different giving someone a good training program to just put on some muscle and get healthier versus giving someone a program to improve their performance. You just kind of tack a few things on here and there at the end or, something like that. And
Mhm.
it's, to me, I try to keep it very simple.
So I'm still relatively early into my training career. I've had my business for 5 years. I've probably been training for 6 or 7 years before that. Or just in total, sorry. So 2 years before that. And I think what's interesting is there's kind of like the bell curve, of course, of knowledge, right? And we all go through it. And, I'm certainly still in that. But there's things that you think you know nothing, you learn one thing, you think you know everything. And then eventually your views on that will be challenged. And it's either you can like fight back against it, or you can actually be enlightened, for lack of better words. And you have your own podcast, the High Performance Physiology podcast, correct?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, that with Chris Beardsley.
Yes. And so I listened to an episode or two when you first dropped it. And one of the things that you talked about, I think in the first episode, was like power isn't necessarily trainable quality. You can improve your velocity, you can improve your force production capabilities, but you can't just work this mystical word of power. What does that mean? How do you measure it? How do you define it? Right. And so that was something that, like, when I first started learning about training, I was like, oh, I want to learn about power. Then you learn about the force velocity curve. And you're like, oh, this is the secret. And then, I agree with what you say, but like, when you're first presented with something like this as a trainer who thinks they're figuring it all out, you're like, what the heck? Like, I have to reject this because it's attacking the one thing that I currently know. Did you have a journey similar to that? And can we also eventually get into that one concept of power and force velocity curve?
Yeah, I've told some people this story before, and it's a pretty funny one actually. So, like, starting out as an athlete, when I was strength training, we did some like really old school stuff for gymnastics. And then actually, one of the reasons I got into like doing squats and like doing power training and all these things was like, as a skateboarder, I was like, I want to ollie higher. And I was like, this is going to be sick. I'm going to ollie so high. And squatting seemed to help a little bit. Power training seemed to do really nothing. I just didn't really get much out of it. And I did it for forever for skateboarding, for combat sports, and never really seemed to move the needle very much. And then after I've been coaching for quite a long time, I had done, internships and seminars and traveled all over and, all this stuff to learn from all these big name guys. And they were great. I've gotten a lot of good stuff from everyone. But then I came across Chris's stuff years ago at this point. And, it was him basically saying, power training isn't doing anything. We got to focus on either end of the spectrum, max strength, max speed, whatnot. And I actually was like, this guy is full of it. This is so nonsense. He's just going against the grain, going against, everything I've learned. There's no possible way that this guy is correct, that this one guy is right. And I'm sure there are other people who are already, going down that route as well. But, I came across Chris's stuff. And the initial reaction was like very emotional. And I was like, this is so annoying. This is stupid. And I was like, what? Take a second, maybe read some of the stuff the guys put out on it, see what you think after that. And, I kind of started reading and reading and reading. And I was like, what? Some of this actually makes sense and would explain why I didn't see much improvement with these things and why a lot of the people I've coached didn't really seem to see much improvement. And maybe I should, rethink some of the things that I really hold dear in the, when it comes to coaching. And yeah, I would say that was the beginning of like going down the whole route of getting very interested, not in so much like programming methods and training splits and all these things, but like looking really more into just how everything was working and like, the underlying adaptations behind training. And, I've been trying to go down that route ever since.
I think training simplified is, what is the adaptation I want and what is the best way to get there, as opposed to what exercises are cool, what techniques are in, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think that's definitely a tricky thing. As stupid as it sounds, I'm French, I'm a dual citizen, and French contrast was one of the first things I learned for power. And just because French, I thought I have to learn French contrast. This is the best thing ever. And then one day, I think it was Will Rattel who made a post saying he doesn't like contrast training because it waters down both the more velocity and the more force-based things, because you're going to be fatigued doing them paired together as opposed to doing them separately with plenty of rest. And I was like, oh man, that makes too much sense for me to ignore. So then it's like, do I do I like despise contrast training? I'm not saying it's always the worst thing or you can never do it or blah, blah, blah. There are some instances where it may be appropriate, but in general, it may not be the most effective way to do things. And then, the podcast as well, where you guys were talking about power and saying that like you can't necessarily train power. And I'm like, man, this can ruffle everybody's feathers who does cleans religiously or like trap bar jumps. And it's like those
Yep.
may not be completely useless exercises, but if you just prioritize all your eggs in the middle of the force velocity curve, which may be a myth, and we'll get into that in a second, and you can't squat, you're very weak and you're very slow, then there's really nothing to do there. And power really is just like the multiplier effect of your strength times your speed, as simplified as possible. So if you're slow and you're weak, you're not going to have auto power. And that's a very simple thing. Having said that, the force velocity curve, though, I'm sure that I'll explain this for the listeners. The way you think about it is like there's faster movements, which have less weight, and there's heavier movements, which are slower. So like a very heavy squat will move very slowly. And then like a sprint is unloaded and it moves very fast. But the idea is that a sprint would be on the low force end, which is just a complete myth. People use like force plates or whatever to measure the force, and you'll have like 8, 9 times body weight on one foot at full speed sprinting, as opposed to a squat, you might have double body weight. So can you speak to that a little bit more, please?
Yeah. So like the correct application of the force velocity curve is really going to be at like a muscle fiber level.
Mhm.
Cause like you were just saying, you have like these huge, ground reaction forces, and that when you're sprinting, you'll
Mhm.
measure massive forces in a force plate in that. But if you look at like what's going on within a specific muscle fiber, which is what you should look at,
Mhm.
if you're doing something like a heavy squat where the weight is very high, the velocity is very slow. So what happens is the muscle fibers wind up shortening very slowly.
Mhm.
And when muscle fibers shorten slowly individually, they can produce a lot more force and experience a lot more mechanical tension. That's why
Mhm.
something slow speed, close to failure, things like that is going to grow more muscle, where something like a vertical jump, even if you do a ton of them, will really not grow much muscle at all, especially if you
Mhm.
train for a little bit. And then if you're moving very, very fast on the other end, muscle fibers can't produce as much force individually when they're shortening very quickly. So you might hit high speeds and you might have those high forces at the ground in that, but there's a reason that you can't lift, 500 pounds in a squat fast and slow. You're just
Mhm.
not capable of producing that same force at a fiber level. So, if people are familiar with that classic force velocity curve and trying to apply it to different movements,
Mhm.
if you just apply it at the muscle fiber level, then it starts to make a lot more sense. And
Mhm.
it explains a lot more about what's going on. And you can look, the individual adaptations that you're going to target at either end of that.
So would you say that the most simplistic way to look at just becoming more powerful is to sprint, to jump, and lift heavy?
Yeah, pretty much. It really kind of winds up being all I focus on.
Yeah, yeah, cool. So I was telling my wife that I was going to record this podcast, and I asked her, I never do this. I'm like, do you have any questions for the guests? And she's like, tell me about them. I said all this stuff. And she actually had a very interesting question, which was people talk about like the art and science all the time, and you definitely have an appreciation for the science. I think some people say they like the science, but they try to use it as like a salesy thing. They might just have a little bit more like data measurement tools, and they don't use it to inform their decisions. And maybe they just show like the before and after, and like in 12 weeks, someone jumped an extra inch, but like that's actually not that remarkable if someone's untrained. But
Yeah.
anyways, you have a very good understanding of the science. Where did this come from? And also, I imagine you wouldn't just say that the art doesn't exist or doesn't matter at all. You work with people. How would you define the two? How would you balance it out? And then where did the science come from? Because I think you understand that very well.
Yeah. So, I think I'll get into the art, end of it first, because
Mhm.
I think if people just listen to the podcast, they would probably assume that every single program that I write for a client is going to look like, the
Mhm.
most optimal thing I've described.
Mhm.
And the reality is very different. Most of
Mhm.
my clients have never heard an episode. Most of my clients don't really care about the science of things so much. If they ask me a question, I'll explain it to them for sure. But I also don't really care to,
Mhm.
nerd out with a client and try to make it look like I know so much, half the time, even if they say things like, oh, they want a tone, things like that. I don't even correct it. I just
Mhm.
don't care.
Mhm.
So, I give people a program that I can be sure is going to produce a result in the way
Mhm.
I want. It's
Mhm.
got enough things in the program that it's going to get them towards whatever the goal is that they have. And then, a lot of times I chuck a lot of weird things in programs. If someone really wants it, maybe they do contrast training. If someone really wants it, they do power training.
Mhm.
There's all kinds of stuff that you're going to throw into a client's program just for the sake of enjoyment and that. And it really doesn't take very much, in my opinion, like in a program to be moving it in the direction you want. And then you
Mhm.
have a lot of freedom to play around, like keep people engaged in that. because like, especially Gen Pop clients, it doesn't matter to them if everything's super optimal. It matters to them if they're feeling better and getting in shape and like having a good time. I tell, a lot of the trainers I coach that when it comes to working with people in person, like a really good chunk of your success is being cool to hang out with for a few hours a week and like giving people a fun time because you spend more time with a lot of these people than anyone a lot of times besides like their own family or their coworkers. They see you often, they see you a few hours a week. Like for most people, that's a lot. It's a good chunk of time. So you got to have like a delicate balance there.
So I totally agree with that. There was a period where I was like, very early in my career, I'm like, oh, it's got to be optimal. I got to be the best trainer, blah, 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 all that stuff. And then I was like, oh, some people like hate the exercise I'm giving them or the way that I'm programming. And ultimately, I got to pay the bills. I can't pay the bills if I have zero clients. So I
Yeah.
thought, like, I had the realization one day, like an 80% good program done with 100%, intent is better than 100% program done with 50% intent. And I just thought, okay, we can mess around a little bit more. We can do things I don't necessarily believe in. I'm not a big fan of like Bosu balls. And one of my clients had a knee injury. And then during rehab, his physical therapist said, oh, Bosu balls are good for the muscles. They're like, okay, no, use Bosu balls. Like, I can give you one thing, per phase, per program, whatever. That
Yeah.
does a Bosu ball. And then you're challenging your stability and it applies to whatever. Or someone the other day was like, have you ever heard of myofascial release? And I thought she got into this big, whatever, foam rollers are a gold thing. And I was like, yes, I am aware. And I'm like, I didn't realize this was a thing. You can pay people to give you myofascial release.
Yep.
And
Oh, yeah.
it'll just put a lot of pressure into you. And then she's like, and it changes everything magically. I was like, that's like, you can't change a tendon if you press really hard into it. It's not that simple. This is a little bit of a sidetrack, but like when chiropractors say, I'm just going to line you real quick, it's like, well, there's football players that get hit way harder than that little crack that you're going to get, and their spines aren't just warped every single time they get tackled. So, having said all that, I'm not going to correct everybody on every single thing and be like, I totally don't believe this. I asked her, I was like, do you feel benefit from the myofascial release? She's like, yes. I'm like, keep doing it then. That is the most important thing. If we're moving the needle with the things that we hold true, that we know are true, and then there's things that you believe in that just get you on board with this world of health and fitness, I'm not going to like pop your balloon just because I don't like the color.
No. Yeah. And like, unless someone's doing something like actively harmful
Mhm.
for a client and like telling them something that's going to make something about their experience worse, I'm really not going to go out of my way to correct it. And most of the time, I just kind of nod my head. I'm like,
Uh-huh.
good. Yeah. You feel good? Awesome. Cool. Keep it up, man. You want to roll your IT band? That is so good. It's not my IT band.
Yeah.
I'm not, I'm not doing it. So
Yeah. That's great. I want to go back to your athletic background a little bit. So I'll say my thing real quick. I was a soccer player, basically just the one sport growing up. And then I realized I learned about long-term athletic development later on. I was like, man, I really missed out on taking other sports further. I did a little bit of like swimming and gymnastics and martial arts when I was like elementary school age, but never at a high level. It was mainly just soccer from middle school until college with nothing else around that. And now that I am 29, I find a new sport because training for the sake of training, I enjoy, but I always trained with the idea of getting adaptation for sports performance. And as a sport, that was the main thing. And the training was just to help benefit sporting performance. So then I picked up combat sports maybe 2 years ago, a little bit of jiu-jitsu, a little bit of Muay Thai, nowhere near the level of you and your brother. But I just thought it was like really great to give me a totally different way of moving and thinking about training and all that. And kind of just lit the fire again. You obviously had, in my opinion, a really great way to have long-term athletic development. I see the stuff you post. I can't do what you can do on a skateboard. Calisthenics is one of my best things. I can't do the things you can do gymnastics wise and all that stuff. You powerlift an insane amount. So can you speak to long-term athletic development? Did you know that that's what you're doing at the time, or did you just get lucky?
honestly, I just got lucky, really. Like gymnastics initially was meant to be like the main and only thing. My brother was an incredibly high level gymnast. Had he not decided to pursue Muay Thai kickboxing, almost certainly would have been on the Olympic team in that. I was not as good. I just happened to come across skateboarding and really loved it. And then kickboxing, we just kind of fell into. Our dad was into martial arts. I actually fought first before my brother. We started training at a gym near us when we were in high school.
Mhm.
And, I was like, I'm in good shape. I could do this. I mean, I did, maybe like 2 fights or so before my brother actually picked it up. And then he went and ran with it. And then lifting was kind of something that started a little bit in gymnastics. And then my dad was very into strength training, pretty strong guy, like a 315 bench and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Had a cousin who was kind of an animal, strict pressing like 250 and things like that. And they got us in the weight room. So then like lifting was always kind of a thing. Powerlifting kind of naturally emerged from that because I just happened to be okay at squatting and deadlifting. I was like, this is fun. And I think it'll make my skateboarding better. And, I just wound up, these things just kind of like unfolded. I never had like any idea even really what I was going to do next. I kind of found something, liked it, and then I was just like, all right, I'll see how far I can push it. I think with all the things though, like I just like to work absurdly hard at whatever I tend to pick. So I just, I do it, just kind of go all out, and then like whatever happens with it is cool. But it
Yeah.
really like, of all them, like gymnastics provided such a good base. You're
Mhm.
doing so many varied movements. You get strong, you get mobile, you get really, really good things like, stretch shortening cycle, stuff like that. And it just sets like such a great base for being athletic and transferring to other things. So I think that was like hugely important.
Mhm.
Whenever I have like parents ask what I think their kids should do and stuff like that, I'm like, well, definitely do a variety of things. But if you can do
Mhm.
anything from the start, like get them in some gymnastics and stuff,
Mhm.
you hop around, you jump around, you do strength stuff. Especially kids, I think, find it like really, really fun. So it's
Mhm.
a super cool base.
So there's a lot of different directions I can go off that I think is really fascinating. I have a 7-month-old son, and my wife and I have talked about like what we would do for him athletically. I like to joke around and say, because we were both college soccer players, I like to joke around and say it's like I'm not going to force him into anything. Whatever professional team he wants to sign for is okay with me. But but in all honesty, it's like gymnastics, I think is, I've seen people do the tier lists and they say like S tier, A, B, C tier, all that kind of stuff. I think gymnastics is the single best thing you can do for a child for athletic development. And then, yes, getting them into a variety of sports that aren't actually too similar is also very beneficial. I think it'd be great to teach them gymnastics. It'd be great to teach them, some form of martial arts just for self-defense and the confidence and all that stuff. I do jujitsu. I think that'd be a good thing for him. But if he wants to do a striking thing as well, great. They're all awesome. And then soccer, obviously, because it's, my first love when it comes to the world of sports, and my wife too. But if he plays basketball, whatever, I think at least one team sport would be ideal so he can learn kind of the social skills with that as well. And I saw like a couple of kind of pyramids saying elementary school should be like 3 or 4 sports, middle school 2 or 3, high school 2 or 1. And then like collegiate age and up, it should be like one sport if you really like want to have a high peak, and you see a lot of high level professional athletes that are good at other sports too. What I do want to say about it is it sounded like you had great role models to help you get into that position. I think it makes you feel good that I'm doing what I'm doing. Hopefully that he gets to see what I'm doing, and it makes it easier for him to do that as opposed to, tell him, but not, lead from the front. And then I also want to say, I don't know if you realize this, but basically every sport you did had a pretty legitimate, like, sense of danger compared to
Yeah.
swimming. The scariest thing is like if you headbutt the wall because you didn't know where you were or something like that. But if it's, I guess drowning, if you get a cramp, that's pretty bad. But getting punched and kicked in the face, that's a that's a bad time. Falling off the rings or something like that after doing a terrible dismount or something like that on the pommel horse, I don't know, like it's pretty scary. So, do you
I
think
would
that
say definitely
risks?
I definitely gravitated towards things that had a higher risk. I would
Mhm.
say, why that is, I don't know. And even like outside of sports, I used to love things like, cliff diving and bridge jumping and stuff like that. And it's funny, I think about it now and I'm like, I used to just jump off like a 60, 70-foot bridge
Mhm.
into water where I didn't even know what was at the bottom, stuff like that. And I'm like, think of it now and I'm like, I was insane as a child and a teenager. Yeah, I just happen to really like those things and like combat sports specifically. Like, yeah, I mean, there's definitely nothing like it when you're competing, like in
Mhm.
jujitsu and especially in striking sports. That first time you're in the ring and you get clapped in the face is a very different experience than anything else. Would I do it now? Probably not. I'm
Mhm.
a lot older, but it's very fun, and I think it was certainly a worthwhile thing, even since I didn't, take it professionally or anything like my brother did, to just, really see, I guess, like what I could do and what I was made of. It's like they're incredibly hard sports
Mhm.
when you train to actually like excel at them, and it, made a lot of things seem relatively easy. Like when I look at regular strength training and like bodybuilding stuff and things like that now, I'm like, to me, it's not very difficult.
Mhm.
Just going to the gym multiple times a day to prepare, for a fight and something like that. The effort is much different.
I also think it serves as great motivation because, I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'10", 150, and in grappling, sometimes I'll go against dudes who are, 250 plus. And I think like my bench press is not 250 plus, but I think if I gives me a lot more motivation, like if I can bench press 250, it might help me a little bit escaping from being pinned by these big dudes and all that. So
Yeah.
I think, you see people in combat sports train harder than, I'm not gonna say every sport, but just about, right? I mean, they train like monsters. And I think a lot of it is the idea that someone else is training just as hard as you, if not harder, and you need to be prepared. If not, you could be seriously injured in front of all your friends and family and a bunch of strangers. And so I just do it as a hobbyist. I enjoy it. I still think it's good for, humbling me and teaching me, to I used to run my mouth a little bit, and then you get humbled in the first couple of classes. You're like, hey, maybe don't run your mouth so much. And I think a lot of young men, especially now, need that. But I went to like a smoker with I went to MMA gym for a bit, and a couple of the peeps, I just went to watch and support them. And some of my friends who don't train at all came out to watch. And one of my buddies like saw someone who lost a Muay Thai fight in front of everybody. And he was like, that dude's a pussy or something like that. I just was like, listen, we're sitting. This is after the fight. I'm like, we're in an air conditioned car. We're going to go get like some Indian food right now. Like, we have no threat. The dude was like half naked in a ring full of strangers, getting his face splattered and all that stuff. He's as manly as a person could possibly be. Like, we got to give that guy some respect. And so I think everybody should do at least one class, get humbled once, maybe chat a little bit less shit. I think that's one of the biggest benefits of combat sports. And the people that can actually do the most damage, I find, are generally the most calm and, not the guys getting involved in road rage quite as much.
No, yeah. My brother's probably the calmest dude you'd ever meet.
Mhm.
And he's one of the best American kickboxers of all time, like an
Mhm.
absolute animal.
Okay.
Yeah, you would never know. I mean, sure, you might look at him and see a few of the scars on his face, but beyond that, you might just think he had a, a bit of a rough go.
Mhm.
But it's definitely, yeah, I think it's probably good for everyone to get checked once in a while when you're running your.
Going back a little bit, I wanted to ask you, we were talking about like I guess the myth of the force velocity curve and the way that a lot of people understand it. Your social media, you do quite a bit of myth busting. Is there one right now that stands kind of on the forefront of your mind that you kind of just want to dispel?
There's one that, I might get a little bit of flack for. Chris and I have been going through a bunch of stuff on it as well. I think, yeah, the idea that plyometrics are really good for tendon stiffness is still a pretty popular idea that I see. I don't agree with it. I think that's completely wrong. You can certainly see data like where plyometrics do increase tendon stiffness, although in the majority of scenarios they don't. And I think a great example, it's a paper I referenced recently. So the protocol was 5 sets of 4 reps with a 3-second contraction, 3-second relax with a heavy calf raise. And that was done, I believe it was 3 or 4 times a week. So that had a huge increase in tendon stiffness. And then the plyometric group did 350 single leg jumps 3 or 4 times a week and had, an increase in stiffness, but not the same level as those, few sets of brief heavy isometrics. So there's a large group of people currently arguing that plyometrics are great for stiffness, but I've coached a lot of athletes. I can't think of a single person, especially in season, who I would be prescribing 350 single leg jumps multiple times a week. So it's like, if you have to do that amount of something to get not even the same result as a few heavy reps, I don't think that's a very efficient thing to use. And, in general, most of the data does not show that plyos are great for improving tendon stiffness. And it'll happen a little bit over time, but it much more improves the eccentric strength of the muscle relative to the stiffness of the tendon. So I think if people dug a little deeper into some of the papers that seem to show that plyos are really good for stiffness, they'd realize that while on a chart, you might see similar increases. Is it practical to be giving an athlete 350 single leg jumps multiple times a week in the gym on top of training? They're pretty likely to get, some kind of overuse issue at that point. So I think that's one.
I think of John Morant. He had this famous tire workout where he would do a box jump onto an industrial tire and do 100 of them, and then he would do a depth jump off the tire, and then he'd do a hurdle jump into the middle of the tire and then hurdle jump outside of the tire. And so he'd probably do 500 jumps of work on. He's like, oh, I just did this every day, and that's why my balance is over 40 inches. And I was like, you were genetically designed to be a gazelle, and you just so happened to survive doing 500 jumps a day. I don't think the 500 jumps a day made you what you were, but there's going to be somebody who's built the exact opposite. They'll be short and stocky. And they're going to try to do this jump workout thinking it's going to get them a 40-inch vertical. And they're going to be disappointed, unfortunately, because that's not the main thing. People talk about tendon stiffness all the time, and they generally are just referring to the Achilles tendon because it's very springy for, acceleration or, bouncing off the ground. And I find, in my opinion, the 2 best things for it would just be overcoming isometrics or very, 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 very heavy calf raises.
Yeah.
I think I saw you made a post or a story the other day, which was I don't know, a 60-pound calf raise isn't heavy enough to actually have a meaningful adaptation.
Yes.
So I think that's an interesting thing. And it's, I totally agree with you. Doing that many jumps is not even a bad idea. It's just downright negligent.
It is. It's negligent and it's not practical. And I think people that are pushing, crazy high volume plyometric programs like that, they've just been pushing them for a long time and they're probably going to keep pushing them. And that's fine. I actually, I don't really care mostly what other people do, but I would advise against doing things like that. I do a few jumps a few times a week. And my best vertical is not, nothing crazy, but it's 40 inches. It's decent. And yeah, I do, 5 max effort jumps in a session. Literally, like that's the most I ever do.
Yeah.
2, maybe 3 times a week. I get lazy about it a lot of the time. And
Mhm.
I don't really do any plyo work myself. I do with athletes, of course, if they need it. But, I think people really overrate how often you need to use some of these things and certainly how much of them you need to be causing like a good change. And yeah, if you do too much and then you just toast somebody's Achilles tendons or patellar tendons, it's not the funnest thing to come back from. I had a partial Achilles tendon rupture myself
Mhm.
from just doing stupid things. I ran 10 miles after not running for 10 years.
Uh-huh.
And what do you know? It happened.
Yeah.
But the comeback from that was really annoying. And so
Uh-huh.
if you take these crazy protocols and you put an athlete through that and they aren't someone who's genetically, gonna make it out of that with some kind of an improvement and not anything negative, probably not a good idea.
I think an important thing to note as well for anybody listening is they might think like doing lots of jumps is inherently bad. And it's like there's extensive and intensive plyos. Doing a lot of intensive plyos is negligent, meaning if you do a lot of very, very intense jumps, it's bad. If you like to jump rope and you're not like doing, really crazy jump height and all that stuff, and you're just doing it to warm your body up or anything like that, that's really not the craziest thing in
Yeah,
the
you'll
world.
be fine.
Yeah, and it also like depends on. So the one thing that I've learned with training is like I'm okay with just about anything as long as you can justify it. I think that's almost more important than the thing itself. People
Mhm.
will say like, "Are power cleans good or bad?" I'm like, "Who are you doing the power cleans for? What time of the year? Like, what is the idea behind it?" And then if you can justify, I'm like, "Okay, that's fine." So I had a coach on for my last episode. He said he liked power cleans for bases and cheerleading, the people that throw people up in the air. Because he's talking about the ability to have explosive power, but then also for the catch. When you catch someone coming down and catches someone on a clean, he says he thinks is a similar enough stimulus. Having said that, we're talking about like plyometrics. One of the best resources for plyometrics right now, I think, is Matt Watson. And one of the things that he says is extensive plyos is just a good way to teach people how to move their bodies. And I like one of the things he says is it's almost like the heat maps that you see in sports. He's like, the idea is if you're trying to improve someone's, coordination, if you can get their foot a bigger heat map outside of their base of support, then that person, especially if it's like an older client who talks about like fall prevention or something like that, that's a really great justification for. I'm not going to have my 60-year-old clients doing, depth jumps to a box or something like that, or hurdle jumps.
Yeah.
Just even just like the fast footwork on a plate or like even ladder drills. I know that people like to shit on them, but if there's somebody that has like very slow feet and they can't move their foot outside of their center of mass, which could, keep them from tripping, and then they get really good at that, then to me, that's a win. And so when people say like ladders are bad, it's like they're bad if you're saying it's going to make you the fastest player on your sports team. But if it's someone who's 60 and they're not ready for repeat hurdle jumps, then yeah, ladders are cool, So I
Yeah,
definitely.
like I was gonna say, with like an older client, like, if you have someone who has not moved fast at all
Mhm,
in 30, 40 years,
mhm,
and then they just move in any way faster than they have been,
mhm,
they're going to get some improvement. Like like you said, there's all, everything's, context specific, but yeah, you have an older client and they want to do some ladders or something. It's not going to do anything bad for them, certainly.
mhm,
I can do something pretty good for them. Especially older people can make progress in speed and strength and all that stuff off of like the most minimal things and even something that wouldn't be a stimulus for a normal person or an athletic person.
mhm.
So it's like you can always use all these kinds of things. But yeah, like you said, if you go thinking you're going to be the fastest guy on the soccer field or on the football field because you did some ladder drills, I do have news for you. That is not the case.
And so, but then again, we were talking about like the art of training, and like you have to sell and you have to like make people enjoy the programs to keep doing them. I train a lot of golfers, country club golfers, and all that stuff. That was actually where I originally found a large portion of my client base. And they don't need to do med ball throws nearly as much as they think they need to do med ball throws, but to not give a golfer a lot of rotation in the program, or just enough that they think that it's like golf specific, is an issue. So I say, okay,
Yeah.
if we do 3 sets of 5 side tosses, it's fine. It may not make meaningful adaptation. Some people will, say that they put on 10, 20 yards just from the exercise alone after a couple months of training, but I think it's just as much to do with their deadlifts going up 50 pounds, 100 pounds over, a couple months if they're, you know, just getting the beginner gains and all that stuff. Or maybe they improved mobility. Maybe they couldn't, open up quite a bit and now they get the club head further back so they can get more acceleration on it. But I don't tell them that. I just say, okay, you want to do some throws? That's fine. Are we going to do a half hour of med ball throws and then you get to go to the driving range and try to crush it for an hour and then you play 2 rounds of golf immediately after that? No. And I also think that people tend to forget the stimulus that the sport itself creates. The 3 sets of 5 throws is not going to make a stimulus greater than people just ripping it on the driving range for an hour. And if we're talking, sport specific, I don't love the term, but if we're getting sport specific, the sport is actually specific. It cannot get more specific than the sport itself. So I
No.
don't know what to do like a med ball throw that looks kind of like the swing as opposed to the swing itself, which is the swing. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's
So a lot of people like, yeah, they want the gym to be the most specific thing they do when like training, gym training should inherently be very non-specific
mhm,
looking. The
mhm,
adaptations you're targeting are specific,
mhm,
but the movements, they really, if they're targeting very specific things, like, increasing the size of your muscle fibers or increasing the shortening velocity of muscle fibers and things like that, they're very likely not going to look like your sport. And if they look like loaded versions of your sport or slowed down versions of your sport, they're probably not doing anything for your sport.
I always just think I've seen like videos of people attaching bands to like lacrosse sticks and then just doing the throw and just like, and so what's interesting too is I have a group of trainer friends that we have a group chat, and I think you may have seen like the gi grips that attach to bands for people to practice judo.
Yep.
And so I talked to them and I was like, there's this guy who said he did a, judo specific workout and he did like deadlifts and pull ups and like a bench press or something like that. And it was all we can get behind all of this. And then he just finished with the gi grips and the bands doing like the twirly stuff. And I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, if we consider that to be like strength training, then I think that's a probably not a very good stimulus at all. And it's not going to have any impact and it's not necessary. But then if we consider it to be a skill development thing and he's just needed some form of resistance to feel like it's a person to like work his footwork and his technique and all that stuff, I'm like, maybe that's not bad, but that's not something that necessarily needs to be in the gym. Do you know what I mean? So I was trying to think as like not hatefully about it as possible. I was like, if we're looking at the strength stuff, when we talk about we can do a program that's 80% good, have 20% junk, and it's not the worst thing in the world. I'm like, okay, well, he did the 80%, 80%, as long as he's not swearing that that's the thing that makes a difference, then like, I guess I'm okay with it. And if he calls it skill development and not, physical adaptation, then I guess I'm okay with it too. But I think that's one of the things that you have to learn as a coach over the years is in the beginning, it's like I have the answer and everything that's not my answer is wrong. And then I think what's been helpful is to try to be more curious and also more doubtful of what I held true in the beginning. But then I like asked the guys and they're like, if he thinks it is like a stimulus, then that's stupid. I'm like, yeah, but I haven't asked him if he thinks it's a stimulus or not, so I can't tell.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you as well. This is probably my favorite question. What feels like a touchdown in your job? And I guess can we do this twofold? Can we do the education side and then can we also do just like working with clients?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on the education side, like whenever I have a newer trainer who is just learning, the art of coaching, the science
Mhm,
of running programs, whatever it may be, and they come to me with like a big client win of theirs, or they, show me something they've written for a certain sport or something, and it's like, absolutely dialed in. I'm like, oh man, awesome, they're getting it. And if their clients are doing really well, like that gets me super hyped up. In the beginning of all the work meetings that I hold, we always ask for like client wins and things like that. Make sure, obviously I want to make sure everyone's clients are doing well. That's the most important thing. And I do get like, even if, maybe I show it, maybe I don't, I think I do, but I definitely get super hyped up when people say, like their client hit a PR, their client lost 20 pounds, something like that. Because I think, the education and structuring programming, structuring nutrition, just like keeping people around is a helpful part of that. So yeah, definitely that brings me a lot of joy.
mhm,
And then yeah, on the other end, what feels like a touchdown to me personally?
mhm,
It's it's hard to say. It's like obviously if a client is, hitting a PR and making big progress, like that's awesome.
mhm,
These days, I mean, I definitely have more Gen Pop clients than not. So I think one of the biggest ones for me lately is like if someone has, like a large health issue, like really, really like sky high blood pressure,
mhm,
really bad, like, HbA1c, like all these kinds of things that like obviously I'm not prescribing anything, I'm not treating anything, but I'm just giving them like general exercise and lifestyle adjustments. And if a few months in, like those markers are like way improved and they feel so much better. And that to me is a lot more meaningful
mhm,
than really anything in the gym. Like
mhm,
it's not very hard to get someone a better bench press or a better squat or a better chin up, in my
mhm,
opinion. It's much harder to get someone on board with all the changes that are going to bring about these like huge improvements in lifestyle markers and then just keep them in the gym long enough to see it happen.
mhm,
So many people start in-person training and don't continue with it, especially in like your average commercial gym or something that's, maybe less, structured and I guess high end than where I work or less, efficient and, good as like what you do.
Mhm.
So, you have so many people that like, every January someone's starting and then 3 weeks later they're done. So if
Mhm.
I can just keep someone in the gym long enough to see all those things happen, like that to me is a big win.
I agree with everything you said, and I have examples that I think of when you talk about people saying that their health markers are better or they achieved a milestone in terms of like their quality of life or something like that that I hadn't even thought about. Those are for me probably the biggest ones. I say almost like I get like the short term gratification of someone hitting a PR, but like the long term gratification of saying like they could play with their kids in a way that they hadn't for XYZ years. And sometimes it's almost bittersweet. One of the most bittersweet things someone said to me is that they were around their early 40s when they started training with me. And after a few years, they lost roughly 80 pounds and just were in tremendous shape. And then they said that they look back and for maybe 10 years of photos looking back, they're like, oh man, I wish I had that time back. I wish I could have been in this shape then. And it's like, okay, so that's sad. But then the sweet part about it is, well, think about how many decades you have left that are
Yeah.
going to be better now because of this, life changing moment, this pivotal moment. And that's the other thing too. You're talking about people can kind of do it on your own. It's not actually that hard to get people to, like you say, increase their bench press or squat. There are people that have these successes without trainers. And I think the main thing is those people are just working consistently. They're working hard and they're keeping it simple. And I think that's maybe the main thing that a trainer is actually supposed to do for a client. I think that a major pitfall for most people why they don't achieve that is because they're looking for the secret and then they let that secret be the reason why they don't actually achieve success. They let a lack of education be their excuse as opposed to lack of effort and consistency over time. And I think that's a much harder pill for people to swallow. It's like you don't need a crazy exercise like there's this XYZ, I don't know, like cable fly variation with a cuff and you're on a bench and this that to hit this fiber of the chest. It's like, can you do 10 push-ups now? All right, you got some stuff to work on if you want to talk about chest. Like, don't talk to me about this perfect, angle of the cable and all that stuff. So having said that, it's like sometimes I think that like I get a little bit too much credit when someone's like, oh man, this, that, the other. And then I think too that I think the major pitfall that most Gen Pop clients have is that they just, for whatever reason, cannot stick to it. Or maybe they try to overcomplicate it too much. And when you just, like you say, your programs can be very simple and can be very consistent amongst your clients. I think that actually is kind of a liberating thing because then they can just work hard. And then that really is the deciding factor. So I guess I went down a tangent and all that stuff, but yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely.
It's like, I've had so many people too, like, I mean, I don't really post too many, like, before and afters and things like that
Mhm,
these days. I used to maybe do a lot more, but I don't really do any marketing and stuff like that or advertising. I just don't
mhm,
care. But people would see some of these, like before and afters, and they'd, ask if they train like 4, 5, 6 times a week, what they do this, that, and the other thing. And I'd be like, they train twice a week. They did 2 to 3 sets per muscle each time.
mhm,
And they look like that after a year and a half. I'm like, it's like, if you write a good program and you get someone bought in with like, just getting enough activity and eating well enough most of the time, in a decent chunk of time, you keep them in the gym, you keep them enjoying it, they'll just look like an entirely different person with
mhm,
even like a good amount of effort.
mhm,
Like you say, like kind of 80/20. Like even if like 80% of the time you're good, 20% of the time you're so,
mhm,
as long as you get those 2 workouts a week and you get steps in most of the time and things like that, like you can make such huge changes.
mhm,
And it is so simple. I think for so long, so many, trainers that I came up with were looking, like you said, for the secret, for like the complicated programming, the complicated periodization, the exercise progressions and things like this. And even like, yeah, the fancy exercises. And I'm like, you can just like chest press, pull down, leg press, leg curl twice
mhm.
a week for a year and you'll look completely different. It's really not that complicated.
But I think that's great too. But I think another way that I try to explain this sometimes is I'll have a lot of conversations with the clients and they'll ask me about things outside of the gym too. It might be like nutrition is probably the main thing. And I'll say, is the meal timing the most important thing? Is it the this? Is it the that? Is it if I pair these foods, does it make it burn the calories fast or whatever? And then I just say, if I give you $100 and I said go to the grocery store and then fill the cart with the healthiest things you possibly can, like try to impress me, I bet you'd pick some pretty good stuff. Do you know what I mean? If I said get a good grocery cart and I gave you the money, you would come back with, some fruits and vegetables and lean proteins. You probably wouldn't come back with just like chips and chocolate bars and beer. You know what I mean? So I think that people inherently have a decent enough understanding that if they don't overcomplicate it, like keep it simple, stupid, that whole kiss and all that stuff, if they just remember that and then they do it consistently, they give their best effort. Yeah, that is, if there is a secret, that is the secret, that there is no secret. I know it sounds kind of Zen, Mr. Miyagi and all that stuff, but it's just do the things that you think are pretty smart. And even if you're 80% accurate, if you do it with enough consistency, enough effort, I think you'll get to a much better spot than the person who's like, okay, I got to be fasted cardio plus keto plus this plus that. It's like, okay,
Yeah. You can do all that stuff and then burn out in a month and
well,
then
yeah, that's yeah,
doesn't do anything.
It's the same thing with the whole like 500 jumps and all that stuff. It's like, cool. If you want to do 500 jumps a day, that's fine. Let's see how long that lasts. And the worst part about that is if someone does something that's actually stupid and no one can reasonably stick with it, then they're going to feel bad about themselves as a person and be like, oh, I'm a quitter. I give up on everything. Like, no,
Yeah.
you're just doing something that's not worth doing. But if you do, like you say, anybody can do 2 times a week, very simple exercises and do a little bit better, week to week or every couple of weeks, just add a lat pull down every 3 weeks. That's not that intimidating, right? But if you said you're going to do 100 pull-ups by the end of the week, yeah, it's pretty nuts. And no one's going to
Yeah.
adhere to that. And it doesn't mean that you're a quitter because you didn't achieve it. Cool. All right. Let's see. Another question I want to ask is, I think we definitely dispelled a lot of myths. What is something that's positive that you're noticing in the space?
So I think one of the most positive ones, just generally just more people training, more ladies training, more older
Mm-hmm.
people training. I've actually a few older female clients now that are just loving strength training. And that to me is awesome. People, so like, I mean, that's a big one. People embracing the simplicity of it more and more. Even not too long ago, people were very resistant to the idea that like you could grow muscle really well on 2 sessions a week. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, a lot of the beliefs came from, like the bodybuilding space and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And it's like, yeah, sure, if you want to maximize every bit of muscle growth you could possibly get. Maybe you want to train 3-4 times a week, something like that. But if you're just your average person trying to get in better shape, put on some muscle, lose some fat, like, if you embrace the idea that you can do 2 minimal sessions a week, and so many more people are now embracing that, then like you can get very far. And
Mm-hmm.
even, like people are, traveling, people are busy, things like that. Like if you throw away the maximalist stuff and you take it down to like 2 super easy workouts a week, makes you so much more consistent whenever you have like a lot going on in life. So I think people just embracing those ideas has made a much, bigger difference for a lot of people. Another one is finally getting away from a lot of the ideas around female training, menopause being some death sentence for body fat gain and muscle growth and things like that. There's a lot of really good stuff out now, like Lauren Colenso Semple. There's a lot of great stuff. And a few other people talk about that pretty consistently, dispelling a lot of the myths that women would have had about being unable to put on muscle, unable to lose body fat. And, I've had a ton of clients come in with like really crazy ideas about how things can work when they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s. And then, you show them the right way, you give them some good information, and they make huge changes and realize that like, the only thing limiting them was kind of bad information. So I think a lot of people are making a lot of good shifts overall, in the industry. There's a lot of good voices now. I mean, there's so much wacky stuff we see, but, equally, there's a lot of stuff that is moving, I think, in the right direction.
I think the word osteoporosis is almost like a dollar sign to a trainer these days because there's so many women that are willing to strength train in fear of osteoporosis, and they hear that resistance training is good for bone density, which it is and has been.
Yeah.
But it's like, cool, you're going to try something that, I think that generation of women for the longest time were saying, I don't want to get too bulky. I don't want to look like a man, whatever that stuff. And it's like, okay, but you don't want your bones to break, right? It's like, okay.
Yeah.
And then I try to tell people sometimes it's like, anytime I say I don't want to like lift weights and get too bulky, I'll say I don't want to like microwave Chef Boyardee and turn into Gordon Ramsay. And I was like, it's just it's not that easy, So
Yeah, it doesn't happen. I've been trying to get bulky for years, and, a 600-pound deadlift later, you don't even know I lift if I have a shirt on. So it's like, you're not going to get that big.
yeah, and then I get backhanded compliments all the time too. People will say you're way stronger than you look, and I'm just like, how am I supposed to take that? I'm like, you're way smarter than you look. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and then I just wanted to ask one more question. It's a little bit vague or generic, I guess, in the sense that if you could give one piece of advice to anybody about literally anything, it doesn't have to be training specific, what would that piece of advice be?
Oh, man. I think especially these days, I'm going to keep it more related to training, but it will, technically apply to anything. Everyone's definitely looking for like an easy route, to success, either in their fitness journey or in, success as a trainer, whatever it may be. And they're not really willing to put in the necessary amount of work for long enough. I do tons of consults, I educate trainers, all that stuff. And a lot of people will ask me for all these kind of tips on business and blah, 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 and things that I'm no expert in. I'm not good at these things. And my only real tip is to take where you're at now, put your head down, work as hard as you possibly can for 5 to 10 years. And then all of a sudden, you'll be quote unquote overnight success. It's like I, for years and years and years, did 300 plus sessions a month.
Hmm.
of in-person training. Even now I do, like 40 something sessions a week. I still do a ton on top of everything else. And it's like, you got to be willing to put in that kind of effort if you really want to get somewhere. And I would just say, be willing to just accept that it's going to take you a very long time, whether it's working on your business, whether it's working on your physique, whatever it is, just embrace the grind as, generic as that may sound, and just deal with it for a few years and you'll get very, very far.
I think if you could tell people the cost of their desires, not even their goals in the beginning, it would actually scare them away. If you told someone do, 300 sessions a month for 10 years in a row, if you just said that one thing to somebody, it's like, what do I do to be a good trainer? You said, do that. I think there's a lot of people that say, oh, I'm okay with being not as good of a trainer and not doing that kind of work. So I think that's actually nice, because if there is a secret, then yeah, it's exactly what you're talking about. It's just working really hard for a really long time. There's one time where I was doing a jujitsu class, and there's a 250 pound, like, former, I believe he's a collegiate wrestler. The guy can bench press 400 pounds, and he's like an absolute stud in the jiu-jitsu world, and he competes, and he's like a much higher belt and all that stuff. And I tried to move on him, that he was teaching, because he also taught the takedowns class at the gym. And I didn't pull it off on him. And I was humble enough to ask, I was like, is there something wrong with my technique, or is it just impossible because it's me doing it against you and you're just way better than me? And then he was like, kind of like, it's just because I'm better. Like, I don't think you did anything particularly wrong, in the sense though, like, I have just done, I don't know, 15 years more of grappling at a high level. And you just started and all that stuff. And that's actually, I think, sometimes an appropriate response. There's not a shortcut. And so I guess I really appreciate you saying that, because yeah, there's so many hacks and everything has been shortened down, short form content, all that stuff. Like, it's kind of embarrassing to say, but I went from reading books to audiobooks to, there's an app called The Blinkist. I'm not sponsored by them, but they're like audiobook summaries, just because like I don't have time for things. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? But as far as like time for my family, time for work, time for training, all that stuff, I understand that there's no shortcut in that sense. So I appreciate the advice that you've given the people. The last question I have for you is, if you were to, plug yourself, your podcast, your social media, your business, please do so. Where can people find you?
Yeah. So on Instagram, you can look up Coach Rob Mauceri, and I post a bit on there. I try to be informative, and it's a mix of training things and then just some skate videos. The High Performance Physiology podcast with myself and my partner Chris Beardsley is on Spotify, Apple, and honestly, I don't know what else, although maybe at other things. And then if you want to train with me in person, you can always inquire for Thesis Personal Training, either at the DC location on New York Avenue near the White House, or at our Tysons, Virginia location. And then if you want to hit me up for online training, the link for that is in my Instagram bio. And, I work with Gen Pop and all kinds of athletes remotely. So always an option if people, want to go that route.
Cool. Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you very much for your time. The last thing I want to say too is that when I started the podcast, one of the main reasons was I was a guest on someone else's podcast, and I found myself nervous and shy. And I thought, what better way to not feel this way ever again than to throw myself into the fire and start my own podcast. And I think I'm a little bit over 30 episodes in now, and it's gotten easier. But the real benefit to it was actually like growing a network. And I used to think networking was such a dirty word, because it's like you trade business cards and try to, like, benefit using other people as stepping stones and all that. And I realized it could just be something like this, where you make friends with, people. Having said all that, everybody else that's been on the podcast has been New York, California, just scattered across the country. And you live 30 minutes away. So I just want to extend you an invitation. You ever want to go to the gym here and do a workout and convince me
Definitely.
to buy more 45-pound plates, then you're welcome. Thank you again
Yeah,
for
we do have to get one in.
yeah. Well, thank you again.
Welcome.